Thank you, gentlemen, for the invitation to be here. Thank you all for attending. I did something similar across the pond, as it were, and I can tell you as a proud American, it's great to be at your very fine institution. Which, like most American institutions, needs some reform, but I'll get to that momentarily. All kidding aside, although I am serious about that, being here with you, and not just those of you who are the esteemed leaders of the political union, but all of you, from this old college professor and former president, is an honor, and I do mean that. And I hope you know, wherever you are, whichever party you're a member of, whatever you do after you graduate, that your participation, your leadership in something like this is precisely the kind of revitalization of civil discourse that this country desperately needs. But I have to say, I am absolutely thrilled to stand here and enthusiastically endorse this evening's proposition, resolved, liberalism has failed. In fact, my enthusiasm stems from believing, as I will show, that liberalism hasn't merely failed. It has failed spectacularly, even embarrassingly, especially for its adherents. Were liberalism's egregious failures not so tragic and harmful to scores of Americans, it might even be worth a chuckle. But the destruction left in its wake is serious business. Before enumerating these failures, allow me to define what liberalism is. Put simply, the liberalism we are assessing this evening is the animating and dominant ideology of the modern American left. Long gone are the days when liberals merely advocated for an expanded state, the purposes of which, as they claimed, were to ameliorate the worst socioeconomic conditions among Americans. In other words, today's liberalism is not at all the thoughtful, albeit only partially correct, political program of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, for example. In that great statesman's place, now stand leaders who, by any objective measure, are far more radical. So much so, one struggles to see the ideological continuity between them and Moynihan, to say nothing of some of their explicit rejection of that too moderate liberal past. Today, liberals elevate the state as the supreme arbiter, even ahead of natural law, the moral order, and yes, even God. To many on the left, the state is God. Consequently, modern liberalism sees anything standing in the way of collectivist, centralized state power not merely as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a target for extinction. It is that process over the better part of the last century that has not only proven liberalism's failure, but has done so by ripping asunder the very fabric of American life. Bluntly, the liberalism of leaders like AOC and Mayor Mamdani is a liberalism untethered from its own roots, But therein, you see, lies a lesson about what modern liberalism does. It is a movement of destruction, not creation. It is, tragically and worryingly, a movement akin to the Jacobins of the French Revolution. We must, therefore, understand the path we are on in America if liberalism continues the political trajectory it has been on for the past 2 generations. In France 2 centuries ago, amid the carnage, social wreckage, and civic incohesion wrought by such a radical agenda, only a hyper-centralized, top-down totalitarian regime could bring order to that chaos. That is the America we would be headed toward were it not for a robust and compelling and successful and popular conservative response we get the joys of living through, and for some of us, participating in. Before commencing the litany of failures of modern liberalism, let me say a few words about that conservative response, in particular as it relates to the resolution before us. What we aren't debating tonight as clarified by our organizers, is what we might call classical liberalism, the Enlightenment era philosophy of limited government and free markets that is one key component among several of modern conservatism. The ongoing discourse within conservative circles about classical liberalism, post-liberalism, populism, the old right and the new right is indeed a fascinating one. But our charge here tonight is to assess the social and economic liberalism of the modern American left. So I'll get to it. Here are the 12 major, but not exhaustive, examples of how liberalism has failed. First, modern liberalism denies what Russell Kurt describes as an enduring moral order. The consequences for our nation, for our fellow Americans, have been disastrous, for denying that moral order has led to a deterioration of our social order. Consider Kirk's expounding on this point. He says, this word order signifies harmony. There are two aspects for types of order, the inner order of the soul and the outer order of the commonwealth. 25 centuries ago, Kirk continues, Plato taught this doctrine, but even the educated nowadays find it difficult to understand. The modern era has experienced the hideous consequences of the collapse of belief in a moral order, like the atrocities and disasters of Greece in the 5th century before Christ. The ruin of great nations in our century shows us the pit into which fall societies that mistake clever self-interest or ingenious social controls for pleasing alternatives to an old-fangled moral order. At the heart of this, of modern American liberalism, is the distortion of the definition of freedom, as the freedom to do whatever one may do versus what it really is, which is the freedom to do what one ought. And the consequences of that in public policy at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, as I will talk about momentarily, in international policy, are significant. Secondly, very much related to this assault on the enduring moral order, modern liberalism has intentionally undermined the most important institutions of American life. What social scientists deem mediating institutions have been seen as targets for elimination by modern liberals who want to impose their vision via state power rather than have any differences mediated at all. Think about, as an example, the organization that used to be called the Boy Scouts of America. Wasn't acceptable. Think about using the American military, as it was especially under the Biden administration, not as the most lethal, efficient fighting force in the history of the world, which the left and the right used to largely agree on, but as a laboratory, a social laboratory for DEI experimentation. Think about public schools, perhaps the most noble institution of our noble republic, that modern liberalism, I won't say has destroyed, as a proud public school guy myself, but is certainly damaged significantly, thank goodness being repaired by eliminating the Department of Education, which has stood in the way of good education. Think about colleges themselves. With all due respect to you personally and to your very fine historic institution, not accepting Yale University. Modern liberals see institutions as vehicles of state power so they can impose their vision. This has failed the American people. It has failed American school children. It's failed the American military. The most important of these institutions is the nuclear family. And it's on this point that I will spend a little bit of time, because it is the family, as you know all too well, that is the basis of society. But let me offer you a statistic from a recent public opinion survey. Consider from that survey that 85% of self-described liberal Democrats disagree with the following statement: society is better off if people make marriage and having children a priority. 85% of self-identified liberal Democrats disagree with that. There's not in that statement a suggestion that you can't go to college, you can't go to Yale, you can't pursue other things you're interested in. It's a simple statement. It's been true throughout society. It's an astonishing and telling statistic about what the most ardent liberals truly believe. And they do so in spite of scores of academic studies by people on the left and people on the right that show by every measure, whether financial security, educational attainment, or just simple happiness, that being married and having children, if possible, correlates strongly to those positive outcomes. Through their policies, such as disincentivizing marriage and welfare programs, started in 1965 with the grossly misnamed War on Poverty, to using media to undermine popular support for the ideal, modern liberalism has disproportionately contributed to our demographic disaster in waiting. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that with a fertility rate of 1.59, the United States faces a death spiral. Who will pay? Who will pay? Who will pay for all of those social programs that have been created since the 1960s? For that matter, how much more prosperity might we all possess today had modern leftists not succeeded in pushing to legalize abortion? The absence of 63 million Americans aborted since 1973 has had gargantuan consequences on the sustainability of the very welfare state created by the left. Fourth, keep in mind, there are 12. Modern liberalism has replaced religion with the state. Even the long-held liberal defense of religious liberty has been eroded. But the consequences extend to topics other than one's religious beliefs. Take, for example, the other religion of the left, climate change. It's true, isn't it? Yes, the mastermind of Project 2025 came here to speak the truth. Whatever one concludes about the science regarding climate change, we do know from the science that implementing every supposed solution would only lower global temperatures by 0.2 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. But to observe that, to trust the science, as government Karen scold us to do, is anathema to the liberal regime. To do so within the proper scientific confines of colleges of science, where none other than the scientific method of testing hypotheses is supposed to occur, is to be run out of the profession. Why? Because of the enormous ideological agenda imposed on those schools, including yours, via government research grants. My favorite example, which is to say it's awful, is COVID. In all seriousness, respecting those lives lost from the coronavirus, the separate issue of how our various government entities responded to that is a reflection of the modern, liberal, technocratic state that told us to trust the science when the science clearly indicated that the best thing to do as a young person, not in a nursing home, not with pre-existing conditions, was to be exposed to the illness so that we could actually not die from it later in life. But you see, this is part and parcel of the assault on free speech that has become the hallmark of the modern left. Think about what free speech in the public square would be like had Elon Musk not bought Twitter. Think about, liberals can laugh because you lord over people on social media platforms. Try being a Republican candidate in the 2018 or 2020 or 2022 elections when you'd be 90 times as more likely to have a fundraising email censored by Google. That's the left. But I'll give you a little bit of hope. Things are worse in Canada and in Britain. Fifth, modern liberalism has created a dependency state, which has failed Americans by undermining the dignity of the human person. There is a long tradition in the West and in particular in the Christian intellectual tradition, that the purpose of work is not merely or exclusively material acquisition. It's a fulfillment of one's gifts and participation in the broader civic life. I anticipated that there would be broad agreement on that, so thank you for fulfilling that expectation. In other words, friends on the left, friends in the center, friends on the right understand that, maybe to varying degrees. And it was none other than the late Pope Francis, not known as a political conservative, who observed, "There is no poverty worse than that which takes away work and the dignity of work." But that's precisely what so much of our welfare programs have done since 1965. Setting aside the commitment that conservatives, at Heritage we're conservatives, not libertarians, conservatives have in helping the disabled, people who need temporary assistance. We have as strong as a commitment to that as our friends on the left. Setting that legitimate usage of those funds aside, consider, for example, that 1 in 5 Americans, about 75 million Americans, are on Medicaid. Do we really believe that there are 75 million Americans who fall into one of those categories? No, absolutely not. This has created the mindset that the state is the answer. But you see, that's precisely been the objective of many people on the left for the last several decades. 6, the modern liberal dependency state has also been a massive fiscal failure. My friends on the right, no doubt, understand this well. But let me give a truthful acknowledgement to my friends on the left. The political right is almost as guilty of this. We have a national debt, as we meet here tonight, that's going to grow by billions of dollars, 37.2 trillion the last time that I checked. The left and the right have contributed to that. Political cowardice is the reason. On the right, especially in the 1980s, conservatives argued for massive defense spending. There was a good reason for that, to defeat the Soviet Union. On the left, since the 1960s, however, with no exception, the left has pushed for dramatic expansion of spending on social programs. Never, ever, ever being willing, other than with the slight exception in the 1990s by President Clinton, because one conservative speaker, Newt Gingrich, forced him politically to sign the Welfare to Work program. Has the left bent on that issue? This fiscal crisis has had major repercussions on our national security. However long the conflict in Iran goes, and we pray for the Iranian people, for American servicemen and servicewomen, however long that conflict goes, America's ability to wage that conflict will be limited because we have been so poor at prioritizing our spending in our federal budget. This is something that we must reckon with. 7th, as a lifelong educator, perhaps the one that I'd spend the most time working on, modern liberalism has been a failure for America's school children. That doesn't mean that individual teachers, professors, good men and women who are politically liberal, who are great classroom teachers, are personally responsible for this. It is to say that, exemplified by the creation of the U.S. Department of Education in 1979, modern liberalism has attempted to centralize education in Washington, which is at best, on its best day, inefficient, but on its worst day, which has been all of its days of creation since 1979, we have spent more than $1 trillion on education only to see educational attainment in every demographic group be mediocre at best, if not decline. 3/4 of our spending in education, and the United States, God bless us, is very generous with spending on public schools. It's a good thing. 3/4 of our spending in the last 15 years has gone not to teachers, but to non-instructional staff, many of whom have titles like the Assistant Associate Superintendent for DEI, This is why, among other reasons, American education, in spite of a lot of heroes in the classroom of all political stripes, is failing. Eighth, the push towards centralization, exemplified by the education department, has, of course, run roughshod over small businesses. Often when you're in the news cycle reading about deregulation, you think it's this knee-jerk conservative response to leftist overreach. It is a response against leftist overreach. But too much of that commentary by the left and the right comes to focus on large corporations. My point here is to look at this at the micro level from the standpoint of Main Street, not Wall Street. And if you take one industry in particular, banking, think about how difficult it is to find a community bank. The good of a community bank transcends left and right. There were 12,000 community banks in 1990. It's a place where it's easier, for the most part, to borrow money if you're starting a small business, if you are local, if you're part of that community. But instead, because of regulation pushed primarily by the left, although aided and abetted by a couple of wrong-headed people on the right, community banks have been destroyed. There are 4,000 today. There have been, just in the last 4 or 5 years, only 20 or 25 that have been newly chartered. I use that as an example of this problem of overregulation, which is a pet project of the left. Ninth, liberalism's push for centralization in Washington has come at the expense of local communities generally. You can think about the precise example of community banks, but here I'm thinking about the embracing of globalization, a project not just of the left, especially on a cultural and social level. Some people on the right see globalization as more important than local communities. But keep in mind, we're here tonight talking about the failures of liberalism. Here I would suggest an olive branch. Maybe all of us, whether on the left or the right or in the middle, need to be rereading Wilhelm Röpke's Humane Economy, in which there are thoughtful criticisms of the free market, but not wholesale rejection of the free market. There are thoughtful criticisms of collectivism, but not wholesale rejection, especially of safety net reforms. Here, it would be a success of both major ideological movements in our country, the left and the right, to embrace this. The 10th failure of liberalism is the erosion of religion and other mediating institutions, and the erosion of those institutions have spurred social isolation, loneliness, and social atomization. There are many factors, to be sure, not just modern American liberalism, but it is disproportionately important here. We happen to know that these patterns can be found most easily, most readily, most clearly in Marxist countries, and countries that have adopted political programs like the American left. Consider what Röpke says. It is a poor species of human being which this grim vision conjures up before our eyes. Fragmentary and disintegrated man, this end product of growing mechanization, specialization, and functionalization, which decompose the unity of human personality and dissolve it in the mass, an aborted form of man created by a largely technical civilization. A race of spiritual and moral pygmies, lending itself willingly, indeed gladly, because that way lies redemption, to use as raw material for the modern collectivist and totalitarian mass state. We must revitalize our local communities. We must revitalize our civic life to offset the damages of liberalism. 11th, liberalism hasn't just failed America's local communities. Its emphasis on the Wilsonian community of nations has led to an absurd deterioration of American power abroad, at least until one Donald Trump was elected in 2016. Decreases in defense spending, legendary under Obama's years, same under Biden. Obama's apology tour, an absurd, ridiculous groveling to dictators around the world. But all of that is topped by a continuous, decades-long embracing by the American left of supranational organizations like the European Union, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, over our own sovereignty as a nation state. But look, it gets worse. The 12th is even worse. That weakness in international policy has translated directly to undermining the social order and security at home. Liberals lax border policies, a purposeful agenda to insert at least 11 million illegal aliens onto our voter rolls has been a disaster. At least 300,000 of those illegal aliens were known felons. We lost track of, the Biden administration lost track of 300,000 children. Fentanyl, coming across the southern border in particular, the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 35 the last half decade. The Chinese Communist Party infiltration of institutions across our country, including this one. You tell me to trust the news, that's what I'm doing. How about, in all seriousness, the Afghan illegal who killed one National Guardswoman and wounded another? How about in Austin last weekend? A Sierra Leone national whose paperwork is suspicious, shall we say, wearing a pro-Iran shirt, chanting apparently pro-Iranian messages, massacring our fellow Americans. And how about worse still, to bring this home to roost, that modern liberalism has failed local government, the news today that the 3 police officers who so heroically killed him now must get legal representation because the Soros-funded Austin district attorney is part of some nonsense called the Wren Collective, in which every time a policeman uses the use of force, he must go before a grand jury. That's what liberalism gives us. But you see, it's even worse. In Fairfax County, Virginia, last week, our fellow American Stephanie Minter, 41, got off a bus and had her throat slashed by an illegal alien. 30 arrests, and the news yesterday from the Soviet governor of Virginia, Abigail Spanberger, is that she will not cooperate with ICE to bring that murderer to justice. That's what we mean when we talk about modern liberalism attacking our institutions. In closing, let me observe that while I am honored to be here, and I truly am, at least before your speeches, just kidding, I look forward to them. And I enthusiastically believe that liberalism has failed. You ultimately should value the actions of other Americans over my own words. Millions of our fellow Americans have voted on this resolution with their own feet. That's right. In our nation's bluest of blue states, residents are fleeing in droves. Their liberal regimes of high taxation, high crime, poor education, and indoctrination are oppressive and intolerable. As a result, just since 2020, 3.7 million people have fled the liberal bastions of California, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Illinois. In New York, since 2020, 1.1 million, 5.5% of the state's population have relocated. The good news, besides the boon in business for one-way U-Haul rentals to red states, is that if the trend continues, red states will expand their electoral college majority, hopefully accelerating the recent progress we have made against these failed leftist policies. Liberalism, in sum, has promoted liberation but delivered loneliness. It has advocated for economic leveling but produced stagnation. It's argued for fairness but delivered mediocrity. And it's promoted tolerance but has delivered intellectual totalitarianism. But alas, there's good news. The French Revolution failed too. Thank you.